Alright guys, what I've got here is Adobe Premiere Pro. This is version 5.5, and one of the things we're going to cover here is color correcting. You get shots like this that when the sky is blue like this in the background, it just makes it a little more special. So I wanted to show you some of the things that I did on this one. First I went in to the effects tab, and there's a video effects. You can twirl it down here, and under your color correction there are just a myriad of different effects that you can use. The ones that I like to use the most are the brightness and contrast. There's a fast color corrector and a three-way color corrector. Those are probably the ones that I use the most. All of these clips are very, very fast. Like there's none of them that last a whole lot longer than a couple seconds here. So what I did is I used a auto color. I don't recommend doing this on projects where you're going to be sitting on shots for a long time. The exposure changes. I guess even if the color changes, it takes values, readings from the footage and applies an automatic color corrector to it. And then you have a few different things that you can set here. If you want you can set your black levels and your white levels. How you want it to adjust the white levels and the black levels in terms of where they're going to be clipping. This one I've set for 0.1%. So what that does is it essentially crunches the blacks and the whites a little bit. You can see I'm going up. I have adjusting the white level here, and so I set that on 10%, and then adjusting the black level, and it just crushes the blacks there. So I'll put that on. And so this isn't color correcting as much as it is like a color grading. When I'm doing things on a very fast turnaround, I don't go through the whole process that I would recommend you go through on a larger project. So here I've just applied an auto color and a brightness and contrast. And the brightness and contrast is, you can see the huge difference that it makes just changing that brightness and contrast. Now, what you do also see is there's the introduction of some noise here. So you got to be careful for that. What happens is when I start saturating this image too much, you start to see the introduction of noise. And so this brightness and contrast, you can pull this back and you can see that it's not quite as pretty as it was. I just generally enjoy a more contrasty image, and I like my high saturated, really bright. I just know it's one of my tendencies, and so I got to pull back from that sometimes. But here, real quick, I just did the brightness, contrast, and auto color. Now, if I wanted to, here I'll turn these off real quick, and I will throw in a three-way color corrector onto the footage, and I'll make this a little bit larger so you can see what's going on a bit better here. So what you're going to try to do when you're actually color correcting, that you have three different values here. You've got your blacks, your mids, and your whites. And so what you're going to try to do, you got the master, shadows, midtones, highlights, and so they're all responsive. So the highlights corresponds to this one, midtones corresponds to this one, shadows to this one, and then your master is all the values across the board. So when I come in here and I want to set my shadows, I can come in and I can essentially, you can just hit the auto black level, and you can see right here it moved that just a little bit to the right, which means it's crushed that a little bit. You can do the auto contrast, and then it sets that a bit as well. But you got to be careful. When I did the auto contrast, it got really, really grainy around here. So the auto settings, it's much better to do it by eye. But the auto settings can give you a kind of a baseline to work with. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little Command Z here and go backwards before I was on the auto contrast. But so there's that, and now I can come in and do my midtones, auto black level there, auto white level, and obviously that's not what I want. It's blown out here, and so it's not going to be able to auto adjust that for me. So I'm going to not let it apply that filter. And now this is just strictly doing it as fast as humanly possible. Set your black, set your white. That's not going to work either, so I'll go backwards on that. And then you can come in, once you have all that set, you can set up your actual white balance, or actually you want to do your black balance first, because those values will stay the same. And you can see how that just made that a bit darker and a bit more rich. Set the white levels, and I can set it on his shirt because I know that that's a true white value, or I can set it on this sun, which is probably not a true white value that I want to use. So I'll come here, set it off his shirt, and you can already see the difference between what it was before and after. So I turn that off. It's made that pop a little bit. And then, so this is your primaries. This is going to be your very first layer of color correction. And essentially what you're doing is you're trying to get the image at a base level so that everything across the board looks the same. Now I come over here to this one, the one right next to it, pull up the effects controls, and I'll turn these off. And I can actually take this image that I just did the color correction on and copy that, and so I'll just do a Command C and then highlight that one, Command V, and pasted that onto there. And you can see the three-way color correctors there now, and you can see the difference that that made on that clip. Now I lost a lot of the information on this clip, so you may want to go back in there depending on what you like and what you don't like, and tweak individual ones, but it's going to keep everything pretty close. Like if I wanted to come in here, I would twirl this down, and you see the thing that I lost is a lot of this detail up in here. Now if I applied this this contrast filter, I'm going to see that I can get a bit of that back by pulling down that contrast there, but you see how it affects it. So it's just playing with it, going back and forth, figuring out what look do you want. Like, you know, the numbers on the side of this may not be really important if what you want to do is have this plane jump out in front of you and kind of kick you in the teeth. So there's a couple quick little things there. If you are applying, so you have your primaries, and then if you want your secondaries, that's actually where you're going to have your color grading is going to happen in your secondaries, because your primaries, what you're doing is just getting things even across the board. You're not intending to affect the image at all. When the secondaries are when you're going to do that, and so you come in and you may bump the saturation and get yourself, you know, whatever look you're looking for. Come in, you can soften the image. That's super quick. It takes a lot of tweaking to get things the way that you want them to, but this works a lot in the same way. Secondaries work in a lot of the same way as your three-way color corrector. Another thing you can do is apply another three-way color corrector under it, because these affect each other. So this one will affect this one. So if you have, if you're setting the three-way color corrector below it, so if I pull this all the way into the blue, you can see that, versus if I pull it up one level higher, how it's not quite as blue. So that's what you're going to want your, let me twirl this back down here. That's why you're going to want your secondaries to go over top of your primaries, because it makes a difference in just the way that you layer things, exactly the same way as Photoshop, if you're familiar with Photoshop. So that's another thing you can do as well. Another couple of these things that you want to definitely be familiar with is just your broadcast colors. Come in here and you can apply the broadcast filter over top of it, and what it's gonna have default values set for NTSC or PAL. If you're going to use broadcast standards, then you can actually take that filter, highlight everything, and just drop that broadcast colors over top of it. And you'll have to wait for that render, but as long as you do that as a last layer there, you can do it that way. You can also nest all of that and then apply the broadcast filters over top of it, kind of like you would for affecting your time code. I'm going to go backwards on that. I did 2 Command Z's real quick. And yeah, there are a few different things in here that you'll just want to play with and get more familiar with. But in terms of color correction, those are some really neat tools. So if I go into shadows, you can see if I pull this away, I am affecting just the darkest part of the shadows. And then here I affect the more gray part of the shadows, and then the lightest part of the shadow values. Now the thing about the shadows is that there's a bit of overlap between the shadows and the midtones, and then there's a bit of overlap between the midtones and the highlights. So it's possible that if you go into midtones and you start affecting some of those values in there, that there's going to be a bit of carryover from those. So you have the adjustments that you can make in here, and it's affecting pulling these color values towards certain areas, makes the whole frame kind of go towards that color. And you can specify that if you want you can see right here how I was taking the brightest part of the highlights into the blue range, and you can affect that more by pulling this little slider down, and it takes all of that into that bluest part of the range. And you can it's kind of like an opacity filter, but just for the color. So you can pull that opacity, I guess, back, and then you can even pull into this color, the type of color that you want to be picking. So I guess you could call this like your color picker, and then this is your opacity for that color picker. And then you also can spin the wheel if you want to stay in kind of a certain color range, closer to a red or closer to a blue, by spinning that and adjust it. And you get more familiar with it. Probably the most important thing that I could show you here that I haven't talked about yet is you have this flesh tones line. And you see this right here. This is the line that that every human flesh falls on. So I won't get this. Let me get you a image where there is some skin that you can see. So yeah, not a super flattering shot here. Color correction, 3-way color corrector. Apply it to this one. Make sure it's pulled up. Effects control. So I can I'll set my black levels here real quick. Black balance. You can see that I have this set for highlights. I'll go to master. Select black. Select white. That's probably the closest thing to white that I have. You can test it. Sometimes it doesn't always work the way that you want, and then you can just leave it the same. You can see it's more of a yellow than you actually want. So we may actually go back to the default value that the camera found for it. And the grays, you kind of leave that alone unless you have something that's pretty close to the gray value. Otherwise you'll throw the image off. And so for this, I pull up the flesh tones line here, and you can see that it's immediately affected his skin tone. And you can pull that back. But as long as you stay along that line, you're going to stay true to what the actual color of human flesh is. If you find what you're looking for, you can say, I want more of that, or I want way less of that because that doesn't look natural. And then as long as you stay along that line, you'll be good to go. In terms of color correction, those are some really neat tools.